Delighted to have the Honourable Lord Stewart, our current president of the club, to close out the Colloquium speakers. He's known, of course, as a former senator of the College of Justice, also more closely for the club's interest. He was serving as the keeper of the Advocates' Library and was involved in the great work which happened through the Abbotsford Library project, and is well known for his writings on Scott and indeed on Redgauntlet. So, Lord Stewart, may I invite you to close the colloquium.
Have you left?
Thank you.
Redgauntlet was, of course, published in 1824, but the action is set, as we know, in 1765. The novel is the closest to Scott's personal experience. The protagonist, from my point of view, being Alan Fairford, an infant advocate, called to the bar of the Court of Session in July 1765, just as the infant advocate Walter Scott was called to the bar of the same court in July 1792. The autobiographical element looks back to the old Court of Session before it was remodelled in 1808. In 1765, the court was still a body of 15 judges, quorum of 12, sitting together in what was called the inner house. Individual judges detached, 3 at a time, to deal with first instance preliminary and interlocutory business in what was called the outer house. That's the old Scottish Parliament Hall. Decisions of the inner house were taken on a vote. There were no reasoned written judgments, but the reasoning could be gathered in remarks from the bench during the hearing and voting. Advocates had the exclusive right of audience, but advocates took instructions not directly from clients, but from solicitors, or writers, as they were called then. The superior branch of the profession were writers to the signet, styled WS, like Scott's own father, the model for Alan Fairford's WS father in the novel, Alexander or Saunders Fairford. Now, a Court of Session litigant, as we all know, I think, the crack-brained poor Peter Peebles is a celebrated minor character in Redgauntlet. In the Redgauntlet story, Peebles is one of those creatures, quote, who continues to haunt the courts of justice, where he has made shipwreck of time, means, and understanding. Such insane paupers resemble wrecks lying upon the shoals on the Goodwin Sands or in Yarmouth roads, warning other vessels to keep aloof from the banks on which they have been lost. Peter Peebles is called Poor Peter Peebles. Poor is a term of art. It means a litigant who has the benefit of admission to the poor's role and is thus entitled to free representation by both writers and advocates. Poor's role litigants were designated, quote, poor in court papers, and thus the name of Peter's case is Poor Peter Peebles against Plainstains. In the novel, this is a dispute between 2 linen drapers who are in partnership, each suing the other. At the Faculty of Advocates' anniversary meeting, as it was termed, always held in January, at that time, 4, quote, lawyers for the poor were elected for the coming 12 months. Since the lawyers for the poor were elected in January of the year, Alan Fairford, who was called 6 months later in July, cannot be a lawyer for the poor when he encounters his first brief in poor Peter Peebles. The Poor's Roll advocate actually assigned to Peter Peebles takes fright, and Fairford Senior, seeing an opportunity for his son to plead before the Inner House, pushes in Allen, taking it upon himself to pay the fee of 5 guineas. I believe about £750 sterling in today's money. And because Allen accepts the fee, and this is in part an answer to a question, and because he accepts the fee and takes the brief, he's bound to continue acting unless there are ethical reasons to withdraw. Allen makes a brilliant debut before the full bench. His submission, however, comes to an abrupt end when he turns up a misfiled letter about his friend Darcy Latimer, who's got into trouble on the Solway coast and may even be dead, and Allen rushes from the court. In the subplot which follows, Peter Peebles pursues Allen to drag him back to the barn. So what about the real life Peter Peebles? He usually called himself Patrick Peebles, one of the reasons that I think he hasn't been found in the archives, rather than Peter Peebles. And he was a Baxter or baker in Linlithgow. The archives have a number of Peebles cases at various levels in the 1760s, but none compares for entanglement, duration, and hopelessness with the case against Spence. Peebles started litigating against his neighbour Alexander Spence, shoemaker, in Linlithgow Sheriff Court in 1758. The subject matter was not a partnership dispute. It was dung, a dung heap. Peebles claimed that Spence's superfluity of manure encroached upon the Peebles yard. In 1760, the sheriff gave judgment for Spence and Peebles appealed to the Court of Session. The appeal was initially successful. Thereafter, Spence put in additional representations and Peebles' suit failed to prosper because of a series of misfortunes. Peebles became practically insolvent, and we're now in 1778, and that year he was admitted to the Poor's Roll. His nominated Poor's Roll solicitor omitted to press the cause. According to Peebles, the defender, Spence, was absolved in Peebles' absence and awarded costs in the sum of £15, 5 shillings and 1 penny halfpenny, and subsequently the expenses of enforcing the costs award amounting to £9, 16 shillings and 1 penny halfpenny, altogether about £3,500 in today's money, I believe. Peebles claimed that Spence was preparing to have the property judicially transferred to himself when Peebles, quote, startled him with a reduction, that's an annulment, of the whole cause, and particularly of the unjust expense obtained in absence. These are words from Peebles' own pleadings. Peebles, being unable to pay, was twice committed to prison in Linlithgow's toll booth, where on his account he nearly starved to death. Peebles averred that he was coerced into making over his property to Alexander Spence and Thomas Greenhill as trustees in bankruptcy in order to obtain release from incarceration. Peebles signed over the property on the 13th of November 1784. There followed proceedings in Linlithgow to eject Peebles. Peebles did not defend these proceedings. The trustees advertised the sale for public auction to take place on the 1st of March 1787. By this stage, it seems that Peebles no longer had the benefit of the Poor's Roll. On Peebles' application as a litigant in person, Lord Dunsinane initially interdicted the auction. Peebles pleaded that before there could be any sale, the trustees had to provide an account of their financial dealings with his property, and this confirms that the trustees were now in possession. On the 26th of April 1787, Lord Alva recalled the interdict and refused Peebles' claim. I've seen no surviving evidence of further litigation involving Peebles in the Sheriff Court of the Court of Session, and I've found no record of any Peebles proceedings reaching the Inner House at any time. Having said that, the catalogue lists, I've dealt with that actually, five cases around 1760. Now, Scott claimed acquaintance in real life with Peter Peebles. He writes, quote, "This unfortunate litigant, for a person named Peter Peebles actually flourished, frequented the courts of justice in Scotland about the year 1792. The author is of opinion," strange way of expressing it, "that he himself had at one time the honour to be counsel for Peter Peebles." Now, I beg leave to doubt Scott's, quote, opinion. I can say that Walter Scott never acted for Peter Peebles, designated as poor. First, because Peter Peebles lost the benefit of the poor's roll before Walter Scott was called to the bar. And secondly, because Walter Scott, in his 14 years at the bar, never served as one of the lawyers for the poor. It is not impossible that in 1792, if Peter Peebles was still alive, the newly called advocate Walter Scott encountered him still haunting Parliament House, like one of the litigation wrecks mentioned in Redgauntlet. But it seems unlikely that Peebles was in any meaningful sense Scott's client. The question remains unanswered in my mind whether Scott got the Peebles story in 1823 from pre-publication drafts of Robert Chambers's Traditions of Edinburgh, or whether it was Scott that provided the story to Chambers. Peebles appears in the section of Traditions of Edinburgh entitled Parliament House Worthies of the Last Century. Moving on to some general thoughts, in the novel, Peter Peebles pursues Alan Fairford with a fugi warrant, a civil warrant then used in Scotland for the arrest of a debtor who's in contemplation of flight, in meditatione fugi. The Peebles warrant is spurious, as we've heard, cooked up by an obliging English magistrate clerk for a fee and subscribed by Magistrate Squire Foxley, who is in the habit of signing any paper put before him. Civil warrants for imprisonment, based as they were on a legal fiction, appealed to Scott the novelist. There is a learned disquisition on the subject by Jonathan Noelbuck of Monkbarns in the Antiquary, and the passage was cited as if authoritative in point of law by Lord Gillis in the case of Tom against Black in the Inner House, reported in 1828, while the Clerk of Court, Sir Walter Scott, sat mute at the clerk's table beneath the bench. And indeed, Scott on this subject has been cited since, including, for example, in the United States Federal Appeals Court in 1975. The physical situation of the Clerk of Court had literary consequences. I suggest a hallmark of the Waverley novels is a species of irony where a knowing dialogue takes place between the author and his readers, passing over the heads of the characters in the plot. And this is like litigation, where the true significance lies in the exchanges between lawyers and judges, talking over the heads, literally, of the clerks and metaphorically of the litigants, who mistakenly suppose themselves to be the protagonists. In the fictional case of Peebles against Plainstains, Peebles sees only celebrity in the interminable process that has beggared him. Quote, "To ken that naething will be said or done among a' thae grand folk for maybe the feck," that's the space, "of 3 hours, saving what concerns you and your business. Oh man, nae wonder you judge this to be earthly glory." Let me pose a question. Was Scott motivated to perpetuate the memory of the old Court of Session by the new reform that was being cooked up by those Englishmen, Scott's words, with their periwigs and their parchment bags? Paradoxically, Scott's Peter Peebles became a byword for wasteful and interminable litigation and an argument for the further quite radical changes which Scott himself opposed. These came in with the Judicature Act of 1825. Another feature of the Waverley novels is the way Scott allows his readers to listen in to the confidential counsels of the great and the powerful. In this way, it might be argued, Scott, in spite of himself, nourished the appetite for transparency and even democracy. We have an example in Redgauntlet, which narrates the exchanges about the Peebles case between two judges, the fictional Lord Bladdersgate and another judge based on the real-life Lord Keynes. This is noteworthy because at the time Scott started at the bar, Robert Bell, WS, was devising a system of law reporting, sitting in court, imagine, taking down the actual remarks of the judges. His project failed because of intimidation by the bench. Contempt of court was hinted at. Bell was called into the judge's robing room and admonished to beware. Lord Esgrove complained that he talks in my very words. At a symbolic level, Darcy Latimer on the one hand pursuing literature and self-discovery, and Peter Peebles with his Fuji warrant on the other represent the tug of war in the author's mind between creativity and a legal calling. In the novel, poor Peter Peebles' final words to Alan Fairford are, quote, "But come awa, dear poor father, and I'll take care of you, and keep you company and deal a word we will speak about, but just the state of the conjoined processes of the great cause of poor Peter Peebles against Plainstanes." So, law wins the tug of war, as it did initially in Scott's own life, but then, had it not been so, we should not have had Redgauntlet, nor should we have had Peter Peebles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angus. Do we have any questions for Lord Stewart? Sure. We have several. I'm going to take one just now because we are going to follow this with a short round table with all of our speakers. So I can ask Ian, first of all, your question, Marion.
Lord Stewart, you may have said everything you wanted to say on this, but can you say any more about the connection between Robert Chambers, Parliament House Worthies, and Peter Peebles, as in Redgauntlet?
There may be someone or more than one person here who knows the answer to the question. The question is whether Chambers got the idea from Scott, or Scott got the idea from Chambers. I don't know the answer. What I do know is that according to the biography of Chambers published in 1871, I think, it was said that Scott called on Chambers in 1823, the year before the publication of Redgauntlet, and saw some of the initial, I can't remember the exact word, something like the initial parts of Traditions of Edinburgh, which was initially published in 6 parts. And then we're told that Scott provided 15 pages, I think it was, of notes for Peebles. And then we're told that the 4th and 5th parts of the Edinburgh book, the Chambers Edinburgh book, Traditions of Edinburgh, were late in publication because Scott held on to the proofs that he was revising, the proofs of his own contribution. And there is a physical record of this in the fact that the section headed Parliament House Worthies in Part 5 actually belongs to Part 4. The pagination starts with Part 5 at page 100, as if it actually should be part of Part 4. Now, I don't know whether, as I did mention, I think Peter Peebles, the real-life Peter Peebles, is in that section of the book. I don't know whether that's all Scott, or partly Chambers, or all Chambers.
Okay, thank you so much. So we're going to take just a short break, let's say 5